Hey there and welcome to MurderTube. A word of warning, this video does contain some details and pictures that some viewers may find more disturbing than some of my other videos. That is because this case involves the humiliation, abuse, torture, and mutilation of a teenage girl. If this is something that is more disturbing to you, then of course viewer discretion is strongly advised, and this is the case of Sylvia Likens. Sylvia was born on the 3rd of January 1949, and she was a middle child of 5 children. Her parents were carnival workers, so they quite often traveled for work and quite often had money issues. The brothers actually helped the parents when they were away working, but the parents wanted Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny to stay home, usually with a relative, and focus on their schooling and their futures. Sylvia was a lively, confident, and friendly girl who was quite often called Cookie by her friends. She had a fondness for music, and she was fiercely protective of her younger sister Jenny, who was timid and shy, but not just that, she also suffered from polio that caused one of her legs to be weaker than the other. This required her to wear a leg brace, and she had a limp. And of course, she would often get teased or bullied from other neighborhood kids due to her being different. The two girls had met some sisters at school, Paula and Stephanie Banazuski. On July 3rd, 1965, Jenny and Sylvia's mother was arrested for shoplifting. Their father was about to leave for work again, and he made arrangements with Stephanie and Paula's mother, Gertrude Banazuski, to look after his 2 daughters for about 5 months, and he would pay her $20 per week. Gertrude assured him that she would care for these 2 young girls like they were her own daughters. At the time, Gertrude was 36 years old, and she was living at 3850 East New York Street in Indianapolis, Indiana. She was a single mother of 7 children that she had between 2 fathers. Those children were Paula, Stephanie, John Jr., Marie, Shirley, James, and Dennis Lee Wright Jr. Gertrude was a thin woman and often described as haggard. She didn't really receive much child support from the 2 fathers, and when she did, it was pretty sporadic. So she would do the odd job for the neighbors to earn some extra money, like sewing and cleaning. Gertrude was a chain smoker, and she was depressed due to the failed marriages and the stress of being a single mother to 7 children. But before you start to get any sympathy for Gertrude, just know that she is a monster, and any sympathy you might have for her will soon change to hatred and disgust. So it was in July of 1965 when Sylvia, who was 16, and Jenny, who was 15, moved into the Banazuski household. They would be staying here until sometime in November when their parents would return from work. For the first couple of weeks, things were relatively fine, but it was when the weekly $20 check payments began to arrive late that things started to take a turn for the worst. The late payments annoyed Gertrude, and she would take that frustration out on the 2 young girls. This started with her beating both girls' bare bottoms with a thick wooden paddle, while saying, "Well, I took care of you 2 little bitches for a week for nothing." In August, Paula accused the 2 young girls of eating too much food at a church supper, so as punishment, Gertrude beat both girls 15 times with the wooden paddle. It was around this time when most of the hatred and abuse started to focus mainly on Sylvia. The beatings became more frequent, and they also began to starve her. She was forced to eat leftover and spoiled food out of the garbage can. On one occasion, Paula was beating Sylvia so hard in the face that she broke her own wrist. She later continued to beat her, using the cast as the weapon. Gertrude, Paula, and Stephanie began to kick Sylvia in her genitals. As if all the abuse from Gertrude and her children were not enough, they also started to get neighborhood kids to join in and made it a sort of game. Gertrude, Paula, and a neighborhood kid by the name of Randy Lepper forced Sylvia to eat a hot dog that was overloaded with ketchup, mustard, and spices. This, of course, caused Sylvia to throw up, so then the three of them forced her to eat her own vomit. Stephanie and Paula started a rumor at school that Sylvia was a prostitute. Sylvia started a similar rumor in retaliation. When Stephanie found out about this rumor, she punched Sylvia in the face, and then let her boyfriend, Coy Hubert, beat her and smash her head against a wall. When Gertrude found out, she beat Sylvia with the thick wooden paddle. They then started to force Jenny to beat her own sister. If she refused, Jenny would be beaten herself. So Coy and some of his other classmates began visiting the house much more often, and they would verbally and physically abuse Sylvia, while Gertrude encouraged it. The teens would often use Sylvia as a practice dummy to perform judo moves on. The emotional and physical abuse, the beatings, and the starvation were not enough for the group of abusers. They began to leave lacerations all over her body. They burned her over 100 times with cigarettes, and they severely injured and beat her genitals. And on one occasion, Gertrude forced Sylvia to strip naked in front of her children and the neighborhood children. She then made her put a soda bottle up inside herself. Gertrude used a 3-inch wide police belt to whip Sylvia. She then used matches to burn Sylvia's fingertips. Sylvia and Jenny were both fearful to report the abuse to the school or their parents or the police, worrying that it would make the abuse much, much worse. And Gertrude had told Jenny that if she tells anyone what was happening, she would suffer the same abuse. To cleanse Sylvia, they would force her into scalding hot baths. This water would be so scalding hot that she would often fall unconscious. So they would beat her head against the bath to wake her back up. Sylvia was no longer allowed to attend school, and the torture was so frequent that it made her become incontinent. Even though she was incontinent, they refused her access to the bathroom, and whenever she made a mess, she was punished. On October 6, Sylvia was tied up in the basement. She was often tied up against the railing of the stairs in a way that her feet could barely touch the floor. She was very rarely ever given any food or water. The torment and abuse was practically ongoing at this point, only stopping when the abusers either slept or watched their favorite TV show. This was now their daily enjoyment. The neighborhood kids were being charged 5 cents each time to come and see the display and join in on the humiliation, abuse, torture, and mutilation. Gertrude and the kids would continue to give Sylvia scalding hot baths, but this time they would also rub salt into her open wounds. Gertrude and John Jr. forced urine and feces into Sylvia's mouth. On October 22nd, Sylvia was allowed back upstairs to sleep in the bed again, so long as she didn't wet herself. She was of course incontinent, so she did wet the bed. As a punishment, Gertrude once again made Sylvia strip naked in front of her children and the neighborhood children and put the soda bottle up inside herself again as the kids watched. She was then forced back into the basement. Later that same day, Gertrude told Sylvia, "You have branded my daughters. Now I am going to brand you." She used a burning hot needle to brand Sylvia's stomach, saying, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." Gertrude started the branding, but then she left to go to a store, and she had a neighborhood teenager by the name of Richard Hobbs finish it for her. And then Richard and Sylvia wanted to brand an S under Sylvia's breast using an anchor bolt. Part of the loop was the wrong way when they did this, so instead they had a deep burn number 3 scarred onto her. That night, Sylvia told her sister, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it." And it was the very next day that Gertrude forced Sylvia to write her own death note. The note was saying that she had ran away with a group of boys to have sex with them, but the boys tortured her and abandoned her in a forest, leaving her to die. The plan was actually to have John Jr. and her own sister Jenny to blindfold Sylvia, take her to a nearby forest, and leave her there to die with the note. Sylvia had overheard this plan and she tried to escape from the house. Of course, she was extremely weak and she was not even able to make it outside of the house before being caught. And as a punishment, Gertrude beat her with a curtain rod so much that the rod bent in a 90-degree angle. And then Coy Hubert took the rod and continued the beating for her. By the morning of October 26, Sylvia could barely speak and she had become delirious. Some of the kids asked her to recite the alphabet and she could not even make it past the 4th letter. Sylvia mumbled that she wished Daddy was here, and shortly afterwards she passed away from her injuries. Gertrude then beat Sylvia's corpse with a book while shouting, "Faker, faker." And then she instructed Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. Gertrude used the note she had forced Sylvia to write to tell the police that Sylvia had ran away and had returned that day beaten, tortured, and mutilated, and that Gertrude tried to provide aid to her, but she was not able to and she succumbed to her injuries. Jenny also told the police the same rehearsed lie until whispering to an officer, "You get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. were all arrested within hours. And then Coy and Richard were arrested shortly afterwards. Gertrude denied any involvement, but did later confess to knowing that her kids and neighborhood kids beat Sylvia, but she had no involvement in it. Paula was lacking any remorse while confessing to the beatings. By October 25th, 5 other children had been arrested on charges of causing injury to a person. Michael Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Duke, and Anna Cisco. The autopsy on Sylvia determined that she had more than 150 separate injuries. She was extremely emancipated. She had burns, severe bruising, extensive muscle and nerve damage. All of her fingernails were broken backwards, and the external layers of her skin on her face, breast, neck, and knees had peeled or receded, and she had bitten through her own lips. She was severely malnourished, and due to the dehydration, she was not even able to cry. The details of the torture that Sylvia suffered at the hands of a group of people for 3 months is horrific, but unfortunately that is only one of 3 terrible details in this case. The second is that numerous adults seriously failed Sylvia. A dad in the neighborhood knew that Sylvia was being kept in the basement and that she had sores all over her body. He did at least report this to the school, and because Sylvia had not been at school for a few days, they sent a nurse over to check on her. When the nurse knocked on the door, Gertrude told her that Sylvia had ran away, and that the sores on her body were due to Sylvia's stubbornness and refusal to maintain any hygiene. The nurse was satisfied with this, so she left and closed the case. Baptist minister Roy Julian also knew Sylvia was being abused in the house, but Gertrude had told him that Sylvia solicits men for sex for money, so he didn't report it as he just considered it a punishment for the solicitation. A neighbor knew that Sylvia was being abused, as on one occasion when they were visiting the Baniszewski household, they witnessed Paula abuse and beat Sylvia. Paula also bragged to them about some of the other beatings that she had given to Sylvia, and they witnessed Sylvia in a beaten, weak, and zombie-like state, and they did not report it. And on the night before she died, Sylvia was desperate for help. When she was in the basement that night, she shouted for help and she used a shovel to hit the basement walls, trying to get people's attention. And a neighbor heard the noise. The neighbor contemplated calling the police, but when the noise stopped, they figured there was no need at that point. And of course, Sylvia's own parents that left not just Sylvia, but Jenny also, in the hands of someone they didn't even know for months. The third terrible part of this case is the justice. The charges against Stephanie were dropped as she would be testifying against her own family, and the charges of causing injury to a person for the 5 neighborhood kids were all dropped also. Gertrude, Paula, John Jr., Coy, and Richard were all indicted, and a trial was starting on April 18, 1966. Prosecution was seeking the death penalty for all 5 of them. Gertrude pled not guilty by reason of insanity, and the other 4 all claimed that they were pressured into it. A doctor testified that Gertrude was sane now and sane during the torture, and that she was not psychotic, but her defense attorney insisted that she was insane. I condemn her for being a murderess, that's what I do, but I say she's not responsible because she's not all here. If this woman is sane, put her in the electric chair. She committed acts of degradation that you wouldn't commit on a dog. She has to be crazy, or she wouldn't have permitted that. You'll have to live with your conscience the rest of your life if you send an insane woman to the electric chair. And the defense attorney for Richard passed the blame for the prolonged torture onto the 15-year-old, terrified and abused sister, Jenny. A sister who could limp 3.5 miles to a park, but couldn't take 2 or 3 steps out into New York Street to beg for help. After 17 days of trial, the jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning with their verdicts. Richard, Coy, and John were all guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 2 to 21 years. All 3 of them served just under 2 years before being released. Paula was guilty of second-degree murder and she was sentenced to life in prison. Gertrude was guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But 5 years later, in 1971, there was a retrial for the 2 of them. Paula this time pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 2 to 20 years. She was released the very next year after serving just a total of 6 years in jail. Gertrude was again found guilty of first-degree murder and again sentenced to life in prison, but she was considered a model prisoner, and in 1985 she became eligible for parole. There was, of course, public uproar over the parole, as well as a petition with 40,000 signatures demanding Gertrude be kept in prison and her parole be denied. Her parole was approved, and she was released. Richard died 4 years after he was released, aged just 21, of lung cancer. John Jr. died in 2005 of diabetes, aged 52. Coy died of a heart attack in 2007, aged 57. Gertrude died 5 years after she was released from prison of lung cancer. She was 61 at the time. And Paula and Stephanie are still alive and free to this very day. Jenny married and had 2 children, but she was always tormented by what had happened. In 2004, at the age of just 54, she died of a heart attack. The house where these horrors took place was demolished in 2009. This is a tragic case all around, and the humiliation, fear, suffering, and pain that Sylvia must have felt for 3 months before she ultimately succumbed to her injuries are tragic and heartbreaking, and as well as Jenny being abused, not as much physically, but for months being psychologically abused and having to witness everything that her sister was being put through. And these people were just treating this as a game. This was their fun and enjoyment, and they were charging neighborhood kids to come join in on this. Regardless of this, Gertrude spent less than 20 years in jail before she was granted parole and released back into the public. She never once admitted to what she had done, and she always blamed everything on her own children. But I think the most important thing in this case is a reminder that as adults, we have a responsibility to report any abuse that we know is happening or even think is happening. Even if you're not sure, if you think that maybe something weird is going on, that someone's maybe being abused physically, psychologically, sexually, however, just report it to the local authorities. Worst case is they'll go out there and they'll spend a little bit of time investigating it, doing a welfare check. And best case, you may save someone's life, or you may save them from months and months of this abuse and torture. Let me know what you think in the comments below as to what the 5 main convicted people should have been sentenced to, as well as Stephanie. She did testify against her family. However, she was involved in some of this abuse and torture herself, and she spent no time in jail. And stay safe out there, guys. It is a very crazy world.